Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So today's lecture is about the history of central banks and the philosophies which guide the actions of central banks. So there are some periods starting from early times. The nature and function of central banking has changed, and we will look at these. So very early in the 17th century, there was a cluster of exchange banks. These were banks in different trading centers, and the basic purpose of these banks were that people could trade across countries without having to carry money with them. They would be able to transfer money from their bank to overseas to buy things from, or to other countries to buy things without having to go and without having to carry money, which would be a risky transaction. So these so-called exchange banks, these were allowed people to send money and to bring back money. These eventually became central banks, and we will use the term high finance, which is also called haute finance or French, and this has been called the money lenders. So these were very powerful institutions because they had access to a huge amount of money. So I'm going to teach you today about the Bank of England, which is the mother of all central banks, which was formed in 1694. This is a very strange and interesting story, very few people know. First, in 1600, money lenders were driven out of England and out of most places. Queen Elizabeth, basically the money lenders were in a way in control of the money supply, because they would be able to provide gold to anybody who wanted. So by providing these loans, they created the money supply. So they were driven out, and Queen Elizabeth actually issued metal coins, which were made of metal which was itself worthless or worth very little, and she said that this is legal tender. All other coins were cancelled, that you can't use any other coin. This action was challenged in the courts, and the court ruled that it was the sovereign's right to create money, and nobody else had that right. So they supported Queen Elizabeth, and it was treason for anyone else to create it. But the merchant classes, the goldsmiths and the financiers, they did not like this at all, because the privilege of money creation was taken away from them. So basically they worked to get rid of this. So one way to do this was that they funded revolts against the kings, and in particular the Cromwell succeeded in carrying out a successful revolution which was financed by these money lenders. The money lenders gave the loan to the parliament. Cromwell, basically it was a battle between the king and the upper classes who were in the parliament. And this has always been the case, that the kings are against the upper classes, because the upper classes are always trying to take the kingship away from him. And so the king has a natural alliance with the poor. And that is why attempts at privatization, the so-called commons, this was large amounts of forests and rivers and lakes which were common property, everybody could use them, and for a long time aristocrats had been wanting to acquire this. This is our own personal right, the whole village belongs to us, and the kings had prevented this from happening because they did not want more power being given to the aristocrats. But anyway, So the money lenders exploited this natural split, and they provided financing to the parliament in return for two conditions: that the loans would be guaranteed, they would receive prepayment for them, and that the finances would be allowed to operate once again when they had been banned. So Cromwell carried out a successful revolution, and then Charles was actually captured, and the king and tried and executed, so that he would not, to make sure that he doesn't return to power, because if he had come to power, then he would have not allowed all of this to happen. So after Cromwell died, there was no particular head of that revolution which had been launched. So the parliament and the financiers offered to give him back the kingship, but in the process they made sure that his hands would be tied in many different ways. One of the things was that the privilege of issuing money was given to the parliament, as well as the taxation privilege. There was the Free Coinage Act of 1666, which made that anybody who brought in gold or silver to the mint, that would be converted into money, so that anybody could create money out of the gold and silver. This was a very powerful instrument, because basically it gave the power of money creation to the private sector. And of course, it's only to the rich that it makes a difference. So King William III is an important figure in this. He started out as a Dutch aristocrat. The most powerful of the exchange banks was the Amsterdam Wissel Bank, and this was the one which financed King William, Dutch moneylenders. First they arranged his marriage to Princess Mary of York. Then James was removed from power, and William and Mary became the joint rulers in 1689. And then soon there was the 9 Years' War with France. For this purpose he needed money, which he got in return for creating the Bank of England. So basically England was defeated by France, who had the bigger navy, in 1690, and so England had to borrow money in order to build a new navy. But King William had no money, and so it could not borrow the 1.2 million pounds that they wanted. Basically, the powers of the king at that point were through the parliament. In order to raise this, he would have had to put in taxes, and that was not really feasible. And the parliament was not very much going along with him. In fact, it denied him funds when he asked them. The Bank of England was formed to provide 1.2 million pounds to the king to allow him to carry out this war. And how this was done, this is very important to understand. He said that, okay, we are going to form a company, which is the governor and company of the Bank of England. Anybody who is a stockholder in this company, basically you buy stocks in this company, that is the money that the king will get. So that's the loan. And anybody who buys stocks, he will earn the 8% return that the king is offering. Actually, there was... So now, so far so good, but the bank that is going to be created will be allowed to issue money. Basically, they said, okay, you give us paper saying that I owe you, the king will give us a paper, I owe you 1.2 million pounds, and I promise to pay 8% per annum on it. And the bank said that you don't have to pay it back. Yani, all you do is you pay me the 8%. And also, you don't need to raise 8%. I will do it on your behalf by collecting taxes. So, but the key thing is that this money, this IOU of the government, I will be able to write notes on it. I will say, this, I have 1.2 million pounds of the king's money, and I can use this as notes to do whatever I want. So if I say that, okay, I have 1 million pounds here, I'm going to buy this company, here are my notes. What is this note? This note is an IOU by the king. So actually it was not the IOU by the king, but it was a note which was backed by the IOU of the king. So basically they got the money, this is called monetization of the debt. They got the power to create money. The money that was created was backed by the word of the king, that was all. So these Bank of England would issue banknotes that would circulate as the national paper currency. The bank would create banknotes out of nothing, and only a fraction of them would be backed by gold, actual. But basically it would mainly be backed by the government IOU. Now, so if you circulate these notes and people say that, okay, give me, I want to get gold, well, it's not technically backed by gold, but it's backed by a king's promise to pay gold. So it should have some value. So the bank said that, okay, yes, we will redeem these notes in gold. So even though it's backed by the king's IOU, the king doesn't have money, but we will act as the intermediary. That is what is meant. You see, the king, technically what happened was, what should have happened was that the banks gave 1.2 million gold to the king, but they did not. They just said, okay, whenever you need, we will give you the gold as required. So now they have 1.2 million pounds, and they have promised to redeem this debt for gold as required. So whenever somebody came in and said, okay, I want to get gold for this pound, they would give him the gold. But they didn't need as much gold as 1.2 million pounds, because if people are confident that the gold is there, then they don't demand it. The lenders would be allowed to secure payment on the national debt by direct taxation of the people. So the 8%, not the principal 1.2 million, but the 8% per annum that was due, that they collected by putting taxes on the people and goods. So this is the model in which most central banks have been based. It was privately owned by stockholders from its foundation in 1694 until it was nationalized in 1946. So basically the Bank of England, which seemed to everybody to be a government bank, is actually owned by financiers. It's not owned by the government of England, and this is the case for most central banks. So how did the Bank of England provide did they have 1.2 million pounds in gold? No, actually what is very strange, if you think about it technically, is it makes no sense. I mean, your head becomes very puzzled. The Bank of the King writes an IOU to the Bank of England saying that I owe you $1.2 million, and now the bank prints 1.2 million pounds as in banknotes, which are backed by this IOU, and these, he says, okay, here's your 1.2 million pounds. So basically, the bank is providing the money that the king on the basis of the IOU that the king. So basically, it's giving back to the king what the king gave to the bank. It's a very puzzling transaction. But we will see how this happened. So now the bank provided bullion. So as needed, I will provide you gold. This is part of the, but not 1.2 million gold bars to sit in your castle. Gold bars are with me, but I will provide them as needed. So technically, the king can ask for 1.2 million in gold, but the king doesn't want 1.2 million in gold. He wants to make sure that any payments that he makes are honored. So the bank now, the king can write checks or can give these notes, as these notes have the property that, in principle, anybody can take these notes to the bank and get gold for them. So this is something that the king cannot do. King does not have any gold, but the bank can. So that's why this trade can be done. It is now authorized to issue currency backed by gold or by government debt. It can redeem the liability of the government. This is how modern state bank works. The government writes a check and anybody can present it to the central bank and the central bank will cash it actually, of course, there's no gold involved anymore, but it will deposit an electronic entry in your bank account if you present it with the government obligation. And it can also collect taxes on behalf of the government if the government owes the bank. So this is not true anymore for our banks.